Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series, I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which is all around tackling negativity. I know a lot of people who will say the worst part of their job, either as a manager or as a team member, is having to work with colleagues who are negative. And so I thought I'd offer you my top 10 tips, should that be your circumstance. And this is my top 10 tips on tackling negativity. Tip number 1, check, is it negativity? Are you labeling it correctly? We all struggle from time to time in work. There'll be things that we get frustrated about, that we don't like, that are irritating, and we may express them. But is it actually negativity? Are people just talking in a way that allows them to let off steam and let people know how they feel? There's a real danger if we don't allow some degree of people talking about what bothers them, that we're actually going to, I suppose, encourage people to keep things to themselves and bottle it up. And the danger with that is it will come out at some stage in a less controlled and safe environment. So beware that it gets a false label of negativity and all that that implies, when in fact simply is just somebody wanting to talk. So, is it really negativity? That's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is separate attitude from behaviour. Negativity can be a state of mind, clearly, and it can also be some inappropriate behaviours. If it's an attitude, the only way you'll know that somebody has a negative attitude is if they display it through their behaviour, through how they act or they talk, or that's their negative behaviour. And you can address that if it's having some impact that's unhelpful on the team or the organisation or the customers. But if their attitude is negative, then they really have to look after that for themselves. And you can, of course, help them address a negative attitude. But essentially, it's the negative behaviour that you need to tackle. And as I've just mentioned with tip 1, if it's just them letting off steam and talking about how they're feeling, that maybe should be tolerated to some degree. But if their negative behaviour is having an impact that's not helpful, then you can address that, I think, as a poor performance issue. So tip number 2, separate attitude from behaviour, and know that you can only really tackle negative behaviour if it is a behaviour. Tip number 3, if they are coming across as negative to you and to your colleagues, do they know? Do they know that you are regarding how they are being as negative? It could be what we call a blind spot. They either don't know that that's how they're coming across, or that they are unaware of their behaviour at all. So they don't know that that's how they're behaving, and they didn't realise that it had a negative impact on others. And by definition, anyone who has a blind spot cannot self-correct. They cannot change something that they're not aware of. So there's some responsibility on the people receiving the negative behaviour to address it with that person. And if you're not comfortable with doing that, and that may be perfectly fair, then you have to some extent live with the continuing negative behaviour, because they're not going to correct it for themselves. So tip number 3 is check whether that negative behaviour might be a blind spot. They're completely unaware of behaving in that way, or even if they're aware of that behaviour, they didn't realise it had a negative impact. And consider whether you wish to challenge that in the hope that it will change their behaviour, or whether you're going to have to learn to live with it, because neither you or anyone else is prepared to challenge it. That's tip number 3. And tip number 4 is to beware labelling somebody as negative. Somebody might actually be quite negative, but about something specific that really riles or bothers or upsets them. It doesn't mean to say that they are a negative person as a personality trait or identity. Be careful not to label somebody as a generalised negative person because they happen to be negative in one particular aspect of their life or work. So tip number 4, beware labelling and generalising. Tip number 5, I think there are 4 key types of negativity, and they're very different in the way they're expressed, and they, in my view, require a different response. Each requires a different way of responding. So I'll just take you through the 4 types and how I think you might best deal with each type. So tip number 6 is the first of the types, which I call explosive negativity. This kind of person sits on that negativity for a while, lets it build up, and then at some point they go off like a bottle of pop. They explode. They vent. They rant. They let off steam. And actually, for them, that's quite healthy. They're not bottling it, they're not storing it, they're not suppressing it. They're less likely to have a heart attack or an ulcer if they let off the build-up of resentment and anger. The issue here is to make sure they do that in a safe, professional and supportive way. So when they're not venting, when they have vented, talk to them and encourage them to let off steam, to discharge rather than stay distressed, but do so in a safe environment, a private environment where nobody else is affected or damaged by the release. So tip number 5, encourage explosive negativity people to vent in a safe and private way. Tip number 7, the most difficult type of negativity of all, the happy negative. Just to paint the scene, this type of person tends to feel they're a bit downtrodden. They've not benefited in life very much. They don't have a job they value particularly. They may have missed out on promotion, not been successful at interviews. They just generally feel hard done by. And then, and I don't know how this happens, they discover something. They discover they have a talent. And that talent is for winding people up. And all of a sudden, their attitude and motivation to and for work changes. They have a spring in their step, a sparkle in their eye, and they're ready for battle. And they're very good. They are very, very good. They're clever. They have worked out most people's soft spots and donkey buttons, and are quite good at pressing those buttons, and are very good at managing their own state. They don't get riled, they don't get rattled, and they have an answer for everything. So they can dominate any relationship in an adverse way. So they enjoy it, and they're skilled, and they always stay on the right side of performance, so that you can never call them for poor performance. Even if they don't look like they're listening in a meeting, they are. Even if they don't seem to want to do what's required, they will. Perhaps to a minimum level, but they will. They stay on the right side of organizational law. So what to do? Well, this is a more general point for anyone listening to this who goes to meetings where such behavior happens. Please, please don't regard it as theatre. You're not there to watch the interplay between a chair that's under attack and a happy negative, goading, baiting, and generally running amok. That's not your job to sit and watch. You should intervene, and you should do your very best to support anybody, in this case perhaps the chair, who is beleaguered. In some ways, the happy negative relies on having an audience, is empowered by that. So stop it. Make sure you chip in on behalf of the chair and don't oxygenate the happy negative by paying them attention. If you're the individual who has to manage such a happy negative, it's really difficult. 2 pieces of advice, one of which is, I'll repeat again at tip number 10, and that is don't let them get to you. However they behave is up to them, and eventually they will have to take the consequences of that. But they don't have to infect or contaminate you. So manage your own response and stay positive despite the challenge and provocation. And secondly, and this has worked for me twice, it's possibly risky, maybe even counterintuitive, but it worked. And that was I called the person in to have a chat. I know they expected some kind of criticism or performance management conversation. In fact, what I did was acknowledge how skilled they were. And I wanted to validate that they were talented. And I listed the kind of skills I felt they had. And it was clear that they'd never had that kind of feedback, ever. And I said that for me, the sad and challenging thing was how to get that skill set applied in a direction that was more constructive for the team or for the organization. And what would it take to bring that about? And in both cases, they came afterwards, having decided to think about it, and said, yeah, okay, it's nice to be acknowledged for what I can do. So a bit risky, perhaps, but all I'm saying is it worked. So I just validate their skill set without validating how it's applied. Tip number 8 is to deal with the third type of negativity, which is depressed. Somebody may, through work or through home life, just be now depressed, and that's demonstrated through some kind of lackluster negativity about things going on at work. This is something that's probably beyond your responsibility. Your job mainly is to show support if somebody is struggling with mental health issues and get the person referred to for help wherever possible. Their GP, occupational health. It's beyond your remit to feel that you have to be closely involved. You can offer support, you can offer to signpost to relevant support units, but don't take it upon yourself to deal with somebody who looks like they may be clinically depressed. It's not your call. It's somebody else in the profession whose job it is to offer that support. You can, of course, whilst they're at work, offer the best possible emotional support that you can. Befriending support. Tip number 9. The fourth type of negativity is cultural negativity. What I mean by that is that negativity starts to build its own head of steam. And the reason for that is that most negative people are louder than positive people. And as a result, they tend to recruit more as negative people than positive people do. And that's because negative people, if you like, are interested in recruiting others to becoming part of their team. So they want to recruit people by complaining, by grumbling, and then saying, you agree, don't you? Whereas positive people, faced by such negative attentions, tends to keep their powder dry, keep their head down, get on with the work, and say nothing. As a result, the recruitment field, if you like, is left open to the negatives. I've seen lots and lots of organisations where there's definitely a culture of negativity, and you can hear people, in the coffee room, in the staff room, grumbling, and other people going, yeah, you're right. And you very rarely hear people say, no, you're wrong. No. The culture is, this is a terrible place to work, the hours are terrible, the timetable's terrible, management's terrible, facilities are terrible. Very rarely hear groups of people gather together saying, isn't this a fabulous place to work, management are really pulling their finger out to try and help us here, It's great how well we all support. It tends not to happen. And as a result, the recruitment is dominated by the negatives, not the positives. And people who aren't particularly negative and don't want to particularly affiliate to the negatives almost feel they have no choice. They're going to be derided, they're perhaps intimidated if they don't sign up. So they kind of reluctantly join in. And that's how the movement, the momentum towards negativity culture builds. 2 things. 1, make a stand for positivity. Provide the counterculture. You may need to be brave, but if there's several of you who can make that stand, you can stand together. And if you're a manager in that environment, you need to be a positive role model. And you need to do your best to create a positive culture to stand against the negative culture. To do nothing is to actually permit the negative culture to win the day. So tip number 10, mentioned earlier, is protect yourself. Just make sure that whatever's incoming to you, you don't let it infect you. You don't let it contaminate you. You'll never be at your best if you allow yourself to be taken down. And you'll not feel good about yourself to allow other people to dominate your mindset. So maintain your own positivity. Be proud in standing for what's right and not allow yourself to be infected. So those are my top 10 tips. Just to run through them again. Tip number 1, is it actually negativity? Tip number 2, separate attitude from behaviour. Tip number 3, do they know they're behaving in this way and that it's seen as negative? Is it a blind spot? Tip number 4, beware labelling somebody. He may or she may have a negative approach to something. It doesn't mean to say they are a negative person or have a negative personality. So beware labelling or generalising. Tip number 5, there are 4 types of negativity and each probably requires a different response. Tip number 6 is explosive negativity and how to deal with that. Tip number 7 is the most difficult of all, the happy negative, and how perhaps best to respond to that. Tip number 8, the depressed negative and how best to respond to that. Tip number 9, cultural negativity and how best to respond to that. And tip number 10, protect yourself. Don't allow yourself to be contaminated or infected. That's it. Those are my top 10 tips for tackling negativity this week. If you like the podcasts and the kind of messages that are coming out from them, please remember that I have a website, www.effectiveconnect, all one word, .co.uk, which contains lots of material like this, and you'd be very welcome to visit it. So that's www.effectiveconnect.co.uk. So once again, thanks for listening, and bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.